in the 19th century, there was quite a few things, scientific developments and theories that shook the faith of a lot of people. Like famously, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, but also geology and the study of rocks and dating them. These were big challenges to the faith of a lot of people. But there's another challenge that came from anthropology that maybe a lot of people are not aware of. Well, Professor Larsen, you have written a book about Christians and anthropologists and the Christian faith. So you're a great person to ask about this topic. What is it about anthropology that was so threatening to Christians in the 19th century?
Yeah, so anthropology begins as a discipline that is looking at so-called primitive or savage people. They're trying to find what is often called untouched people groups. Like here is these people who've lived the same way of life, maybe in Australia with Aborigines or somewhere like that in the Central Africa, and they've kept up this way of life that in the minds of Europeans was what their culture was like many, tens of thousands of years ago or whatever time frame you're on. And so the idea was we can learn about how human beings were in their origins by people alive today who we think of as primitive or savage. And they would decide that, it's a contrast. Those people are the opposite of us. We're rational, we're modern, we're all these kind of self-flattering things. And so they would encode a kind of stages of development. Like there's primitive people, and then there's barbarian people, and then there's civilized modern people, and that's us, and the others are them. And they decide that religion is something that's primitive. It's irrational. It's something that is a mistake of early thinking that humanity's meant to grow out of. And so you start to kind of, if you've accepted that scheme, you start to think that, maybe if I want to be really civilized, really modern, I should get rid of faith because that's part of being savage and primitive. So that was how the thinking got going.
That's something that I think we can still observe today on campuses and workplaces. There is sometimes that attitude that religion is something of the past and that shouldn't exist today. It causes problems and things like that.
Yeah, these kind of ideas of humanity going in stages are very kind of subtle ways of kind of getting people to think something is true when actually it's just an assertion. So there is no proof. You're not proving that humanity goes through 3 stages. You're just made up 3 stages, Yeah. But it feels like, I'm supposed to keep up by being modern, and those things belong to a previous stage, and therefore I'm behind the times. That was the kind of way of thinking that put pressure on people to imagine that they ought to not be as religious as they were because they wanted to be more modern.
Yeah. What kind of arguments did they make when they wanted to prove that Christianity belonged to the past?
So again, it's just this connection. You can see this in these early primitive savage cultures. They're very religious. Therefore, this must be like the thinking of early people before they understand how things work. A lot of it was a contrast with science. There was an imagining that primitive people are unscientific. That was less true than they thought as well. Primitive people understood very well, again, so-called primitive people, like how agriculture works, how to do all kinds of things in the world that are taking advantage of a very close study of nature and natural laws and how things work. But they wanted this contrast. Those people are superstitious. They do things that are irrational. We do things that are rational, and therefore religion gets encoded as part of the irrational, superstitious part.
Right. So the Christians in the 19th century that found this troubling and it shook their faith.
Yeah.
Were they really just not noticing that it's an assertion with no proof? Or were they hearing examples of things that they couldn't deal with?
I think I like the way you put it a lot. I think they are not noticing that it's an assertion without proof. It's just what people are noticing is what's inherent to humanity. So if you take so-called primitive people, You could say anything. They enjoy music. They enjoy dancing. Well, those aren't primitive things. Those are human things, And so, yeah, religion is part of these cultures because it's part of human culture in general. And so, yeah, there's a lot of assumptions being made that are turned into a proof that isn't a proof at all. It's just an assertion.
Right. The title of your book is the Slain God. Well, that's the subtitle.
It's the title, yes.
Yeah, the title, yeah. What is this slain God motif that you're alluding to in the title?
So that particularly comes from James Frazer, who wrote The Golden Bough, which was a very influential anthropology book. And what Frazer does is he collects from all kinds of ancient cultures and so-called primitive cultures around the world in his time, stories of a dying and rising God. He connects this primarily to agriculture, that, the crops, die in the winter and come back in the spring. And so he thinks that is just a natural way of thinking for a pre-scientific culture, because you can find it in various cultures. And therefore, the implication that he wants you to come to is that the story of Jesus dying and rising again is just a primitive way of thinking that is reflective of that mindset rather than a historical reality or a profound insight.
Okay. How would you answer James Frazer? What do you think is the difference between Christian faith in Jesus' death and resurrection and these myths?
Yeah, well, there are two different things that I would emphasize. The first is that Jesus did not die and rise again in a pre-literate culture. The Roman culture was filled with records. This is a very well-documented life and a well-documented story. It's not a myth. It is part of the historical record that you can go to for all of those kind of different ideological and religious viewpoints. You can hear people talking about Jesus in that world in all kinds of records. There are numerous written records about Jesus. So that's not just some kind of perennial mythical story. It's a human historical story. But then also, if the gospel is true, then of course it is something that resonates universally with the human condition. And so this longing that God would experience what human life is like, understand our suffering from the inside and triumph over it, that story is there in lots of cultures because it's a story that humans are attracted to and need. And the gospel is speaking a reality to the human condition.
Right. Well, are there some of the slain God myths that I'm familiar with? Is like, you mentioned I think the seasons.
Yeah.
In the winter, the god is dead.
Yeah.
And then in the summer, the god's alive. So that seems to me really different from what Jesus does with his death and resurrection. It's not just a seasonal pattern, but it's so much more than that. Are there any ancient myths that are more like how significant Jesus' death and resurrection is?
I don't think so. I mean, again, you can find connections if you want to find, parts of stories. And Frazer is very good at that. Like, he'll take just one bit of a story and say, oh, I bet the rest of this is left out. And there must be also these other parts that are not there, part of the record, because he wants to make it one universal story. I think the story of Jesus is unique in lots of ways. And that is illustrated by the fact that Christians are such a small persecuted sect in the Roman Empire, and yet that story just travels and travels. People are attracted to it. People are changed by it. If the story that was close enough to that story in Egyptian culture, in Persian culture or whatever, then they wouldn't need this new story. This new story is coming to them with the force of revelation as something powerful and transformative, and therefore it's distinct.
Yeah. Are there arguments that anthropologists have made in favor of Christianity?
Yeah, things have changed a lot. So partly what I want to notice about the original anti-Christian view is it was very racist. It was very ethnocentric. It was very wrapped up in colonialism. So all of those things anthropologists are now against, So like this idea, that's why I keep on trying very carefully to say so-called primitive cultures, so-called savages, because nobody thinks that way anymore. And anthropologists are deeply embarrassed by that. These cultures have their own integrity. They have their own worldview and logic. They're not thinking irrationally, we're thinking rationally. That assumption is completely gone in anthropology. So that eventually leads them on to think, well, if we are now seeing and honoring the integrity of these other cultures, what makes us so snide and dismissive about the integrity of Christian thought and Christian beliefs? And they have to come around and think about that afresh, which is kind of a work in progress right now happening in the discipline of anthropology.
Okay. In your book, you talk about some anthropologists who became Christians. So it sounds like, is that, you said it's still going on?
Yeah, those are early pioneers. I'm glad you're bringing that up. Evans Pritchard is a big example. Victor Turner is another very large example. These are leading theorists of anthropology who became adult converts to Christianity. It was very shocking for the discipline of anthropology to have their best theorists turn to the Christian faith. Victor Turner had to write a long letter, which I've read, it's in an archives, to his PhD mentor, basically trying to smooth over the fact, I know that you really are anti-Christian and that I'm kind of your beloved disciple, but I've become a Christian and I want to explain my reasons why. Evans Pritchard writes very openly, I was taught that you couldn't be an anthropologist and a Christian, you had to be an agnostic, and he proves that wrong. And some of that is the anthropology itself. Well, the anthropology makes them think deeply about the meaning of life, about what it means to be human, about human longing, about human connection to the spiritual and the eternal. And so in some ways, if you're a good anthropologist, this kind of veneer of we're civilized, which means thinly secular, doesn't make sense because that's not how many people live anywhere in the world. And then if you take that veneer away, then you have to answer the questions. Well, if there is a realm of the spirit, what's true about it? What do I believe about it? How do I relate to it? And that's the journey that Evans Pritchard and Victor Turner and other anthropologists go on that leads them to the Christian faith.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I recommend the book. If you're watching this and you're finding this conversation interesting, check out the book by Timothy Larsen, The Slain God, Anthropologists in the Christian Faith. That's the full title, right?
You got it exactly right, yes. Can I add another thing? For me, like one of the things that surprised me, I'm not trained as an anthropologist. I read a lot of anthropology in order to do the book. And so I was coming at it new myself. The core of anthropology is what's called an ethnography, a very careful study of a particular people. And it really kind of changed some of my views. People often think of the Old Testament in particular as a very weird, strange, problematic book filled with things that are would be better left out or that can't be defended. And when I started reading ethnographies, I realized how much of the things that are thought of that way in our culture today, in Europe, in the United States, and Canada, is actually just so typical of human experience. Sacrifice, including animal sacrifice, is very common through cultures across the world. Circumcision is very common through cultures across the world. Lots of things that look very exotic in the Old Testament to us are actually reflections of how humans have lived in many different cultures that haven't even had any connection with each other. And so they represent something that has been a human response to issues that have raised desire to build unity among people and to respond to their situation that are actually quite common. And so you see the Old Testament as a book that speaks to human beings the way they really are and the way they really live.
What do you think has happened to our culture that has made these things seem so strange?
Yeah, it's this kind of self-flattering thing of not wanting to really connect with things that are very natural and very human. And so the desire to tell ourselves a story that we're different There's a joke among anthropologists that the one thing all cultures have in common is the belief that they're unique and different. And so it's a very common thing. If you go to the Azandi in the Congo, they will say our people are different. We have the true story, and we're special. And so we're doing that as Western people, and we imagine that we've transcended these other cultures, but we're actually reflecting them by imagining ourselves to be different and unique and having kind of outgrown things that we haven't really outgrown. One of the things Evan Pritchard does is say, all worldviews are kind of self-contained. They make sense, they're logical within them, but there's no place outside of them in which there's you can just be oh, I'm the logical person outside of a worldview, and that's how I assess things. So he does that with Freudian thought and Marxist thought and lots of things that secular Western people have thought of as what they believe. Those are no more and no less rational than what people have believed in cultures all around the world. It's a worldview.
Mm. Yeah, a lot of people, in their own language, their word for themselves is just it means the people.
Yeah.
Etymologically. There's I'm reading Ethnography by Lucas Bridges about the people who lived in the far south of South America in Tierra del Fuego. And there's the Alakaloof and the Yamana, I think they're called, and the Ona. And if I remember right, I think all of them are just using their own language to refer to themselves as the people.
Yeah.
And Lucas Bridges his culture, he's born in this land, but his family are English. So he's got this English culture that's so different from the local people at Tierra del Fuego. But he's so good at seeing things their way because he's grown up with them. So things that would be outrageous to us, it's not unusual for them to kill each other in a fight.
Yeah.
But he's so unjudgmental when he describes it and tries to help you see things from their perspective. But yeah, often we see the world through our own culture, and when we come up against another culture, we just think, well, that's bad and wrong, instead of recognizing it's different. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe actually we're wrong.
Yeah, and that's anthropology wants you to think that way. And even whether it's right or wrong, you kind of dial that down and you first try to understand what does this mean to these people? How does it work in their culture? And that's a very anthropological instinct. We talked a minute ago about Jesus' death and resurrection. And I mentioned about how common sacrifice is throughout cultures. And that's the story of the gospel is so interesting because it both affirms that human instinct and it also transcends it. So Jesus comes into a world where all kinds of religions are sacrificing animals. There are some places where there's human sacrifice, and that idea of human sacrifice is at least still in the air. And by his death, Jesus is connecting to that part of humanity that believes a sacrifice has to happen. But by his death and resurrection being a once and for all permanent sacrifice, he's also abolishing and bringing to an end all of that. And so those who think, oh, well, that is something that is kind of icky and wrong about cultures to have these animal sacrifices. Well, the good news of the gospel is Jesus' death and resurrection brought an end to all other sacrifice. It's a story that transcends the need for humans to have sacrifice ever again.
Yeah, I guess maybe the reaction to if you're in a culture that doesn't practice it because historically that culture believed in the sufficiency of Jesus' sacrifice. You've inherited a way of thinking about sacrifice and its necessity. That's the context of it is the gospel that Jesus has provided the sufficient sacrifice.
Yeah, that's well said.
You can then be judgmental of something, but you don't know the reason why your ancestors stopped.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, many critiques of Christianity are actually critiques that only make sense if you've been taught Christianity.
Yeah.
So one of the ones that often comes to me is Christians are frequently criticized for being hypocrites. But Jesus is the one who introduced the idea of criticizing people for being hypocrites. The Romans didn't care less, could care less what was going on in your heart. They just wanted you to behave outwardly in the right way, give homage to the emperor or whatever. They didn't care what you thought. Well, Jesus said, well, it actually matters what's going on in your heart. Do you really are you inside, do you have this evil that you're covering up with this superficial outward attempt to look like you're doing things right? And so to me, whenever anybody critiques Christians for being hypocrites, they believe Jesus was right. And this critique matters.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the criticisms, I guess, they're taking a Christian value, but it's detached from the story of the gospel.
Yeah, they've forgotten, like you've said, where it comes from.
Yeah.
It's inconceivable to have an idea of human rights outside of the gospel story of human beings made in the image of God and therefore having dignity, and that revelation that you cannot murder people because they're made in the image of God. That's the root of all that. And yet it's very common for secular people to be against Christianity, but in favor of human rights without seeing the lineage of where that idea came from.
Yeah. I think ethnography and anthropology can be helpful in broadening your mind and showing you how your culture is maybe not the only way to see things.
Yes, it is. And that's so important. There are different ways of doing things, and understanding the integrity of somebody else's way of doing something is a real opportunity for growth and maturity. I've lived in multiple countries in my life, and I've seen Americans especially come to different countries, and I could tell right away whether they could survive or not. And the ones who were not going to make it were the ones who had in their head very strongly, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this, and I'm going to teach this culture the right way. There's a better way to wash dishes or do laundry or whatever, and I'm going to re-educate this culture on how to do it. And the ones who could say, this is how we do it here, and fall in line more were the ones who were going to make it.
Yeah. The thing that is a struggle for me when I've lived abroad or traveled is queuing, because we do that right in Britain.
Yes.
Everybody else does it right. Well, actually, Americans they queue well enough. But yeah, when I was in Russia or Spain or France, I find it so, I'd be so angry that I'm near the door and people just push past me.
Yes.
But it's not part of their culture. It works for them, but it's hard to accept.
To accept where you're at and how things are done in this culture.
Yeah, queuing is not. It's not an ultimate morality. It's just how we like to do it in Britain. Yeah. Well, have you got any final encouragements that you'd like to share with viewers who are interested in anthropology and Christianity?
This is a great time for that interaction right now. I have heard from lots of anthropologists who have thought of themselves as secular or agnostic, who are interested in Christianity and the gospel in new ways just in the last few years. That's being really rethought in the discipline. Like, why did we have this prejudice against Christianity? I know anthropologists who are going to church for the first time and are kind of on a journey of exploration and seeking. And so I think it's an exciting time for the interaction between these two things.
Yeah, there's something to pray for, that these anthropologists would see the truth of the gospel. And also, if you're viewing and you're thinking about becoming a Christian, I hope that this video is helping you to see like Tim was saying, the needs and the desires that we have are all across the world, all cultures, are yearning for a God who will know our struggle, who will sympathize with our weakness. And that is Christianity. Jesus is the great high priest who sympathizes with our weakness. So we don't need to be afraid. If we want to find mercy and grace, we can approach the throne of God with boldness through faith in Jesus. That's a gift that you can have through faith in Jesus. If you enjoyed this, leave a comment, maybe ask a question, and perhaps Tim will see it, or I might remember it, and if I have another anthropology conversation, I can remember it and ask.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you.